Close your eyes. Picture this. You're shivering under an animal hide, in the middle of an endless ice age. Night, 900,000 years ago. The stars above are sharp as knives. The wind cuts like glass. And there's no central heating, no takeout delivery, not even a single gas station hot dog to save you. Just you and a very hungry neighbor, eyeing your thigh like it's the last rotisserie chicken at Costco. Yes, this was life for our ancestors. Nights so cold that the human population shrank to fewer than 1,300 breeding adults on the entire planet. That's smaller than the guest list at your cousin's wedding reception. Survival wasn't just hard. It was a full-time nightmare. People were starving, teeth chattering, stomachs growling, and sometimes, when there was nothing else to eat, well, they looked at each other. Tonight, I'll take you back there. Not to scare you, though, let's be honest. It's pretty scary. But to lull you gently, to sleep with the strange, tragic, and occasionally hilarious story of how humanity almost didn't make it. We'll talk about brutal winters, desperate diets, the invention of fire, and yes, the dark whispers of cannibalism. But don't worry, we'll keep it soothing, almost cozy, because nothing says bedtime quite like ancient famine sprinkled with jokes about how your ancestors probably argued over who got the last cricket. So, snuggle in, adjust your blanket fortress. You're safe. You've got heating, snacks, and Netflix. Our ancestors had sticks and desperation. And somehow, they still kept humanity alive. Let's begin. The night is not just cold, it is so cold it feels like the air itself has frozen into something sharp. Imagine the sensation of walking outside, and instead of air brushing against your face, it's little shards of invisible glass. That's how a night, 900,000 years ago, felt. The sky was clear, sprinkled with more stars than you've ever seen. Stars so bright, they didn't twinkle softly. They sliced through the black with the indifference of distant suns that didn't care if you lived or froze. Down below, on the surface of the earth, a group of early humans huddled together, not in a grand cave painting scene with mammoths and torches. No, that's Hollywood. This was quieter, more desperate, and smaller. Maybe 20 or 30 individuals, pressed shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in crude hides stitched with animal sinew, the kind of tailoring you'd never see on a Paris runway. But that made the difference between life and death. They sit around a tiny fire. And when I say fire, don't picture a roaring campfire with s'mores and acoustic guitar. Picture instead a few glowing sticks that they had been trying desperately to keep alive since morning, because making fire wasn't a casual skill, yet it was more like winning the lottery. If the embers died, you didn't just lose heat. You lost cooking, protection from predators, light in the endless dark. Without it, the night didn't just get colder, it got hungrier. The landscape around them was brutal. Trees twisted into bare claws against the horizon, the ground frozen hard as stone. Even the rivers had given up and turned to blocks of glittering ice. The only sound was the wind, sweeping endlessly across plains and valleys, moaning like some angry spirit that wanted you gone. If you've ever heard wind rattling through a cracked window on a winter night, amplify that by 10, and you're still nowhere close. Now, as you lie in your warm bed, your blanket wrapped around you, your pillow perfectly adjusted, imagine how absurdly luxurious that would have seemed to them. They would have traded their last scrap of dried meat just to know what it feels like to be at 68 degrees Fahrenheit with a thermostat you can tap like a magician's wand. For them, there was no thermostat. There was no, oh, I'll just put the kettle on and make tea. Tea didn't exist. The kettle didn't exist. And honestly, the idea of relaxing with a warm drink might have felt like science fiction. Instead, every night was a negotiation with death. The fire flickers, and the adults lean forward instinctively, feeding it carefully with whatever kindling they've saved. Children cling to their parents, breathing tiny clouds into the darkness. The smell is a mix of smoke, sweat, and fear. Not exactly a scented candle vibe. If Yankee Candle made prehistoric fragrances, it would be called Desperation Musk or Campfire Panic. But here's the thing. There was beauty in it too, because when the wind paused for even a moment, the silence was deep and absolute, the kind of silence modern humans rarely experience. No traffic, no buzzing power lines, no hum of refrigerators, just the crackle of the fire, the shuffle of bodies pressing close, and above you, the endless sweep of the Milky Way. The same stars you see now, but back then, they weren't dulled by light pollution. They burned down like a cosmic floodlight. So close, you might think you could reach up and pluck one. Imagine falling asleep under that ceiling of infinite glitter, knowing that every breath you took was a victory. Every morning you woke up was proof that somehow, despite everything, you hadn't become part of the frozen earth. That was life. That was the scene. Humanity wasn't thriving. Humanity wasn't building. Humanity was clinging. And sometimes clinging looks less like a noble painting and more like 20 half-frozen people trying not to breathe too hard because the cold steals even that. And why were they there? Why such a small group? That takes us into the mystery of the human bottleneck. The human bottleneck. Not a traffic jam, not a concert crowd waiting for the band to play their encore, but a moment in evolutionary history when our species nearly went extinct. And when I say nearly, I mean teetering on the razor's edge of complete annihilation. Genetic studies show that, around 900,000 years ago, the entire population of breeding humans collapsed to roughly 1,280 individuals. To put that into perspective, that's smaller than the number of people crammed into a mid-sized IKEA on a Saturday afternoon. That's fewer than the fans at a high school basketball game. That's fewer than the number of YouTube comments under a cat video arguing about whether the cat looks chunky or just fluffy. Now, imagine that's it. That's the whole human race. Every single one of us today, all 8 billion of us scrolling TikTok and buying oat milk and arguing about pineapple on pizza, we all descend from those 1,280 survivors. Your DNA, my DNA, every person you've ever met, every strand of it flows back to that ridiculously small group that managed to survive the worst climate crisis our species has ever seen. The cause was climate chaos. The Earth's rhythms went haywire. Before this period, ice ages came in relatively predictable cycles of about 41,000 years. Cold, warm, like nature, had set a timer. But around 900,000 years ago, the system glitched. Ice ages stretched to cycles of 100,000 years. Glaciers grew massive. Seas dropped hundreds of feet. And Africa, where our ancestors lived, dried into something barely recognizable. What was once lush woodland shriveled into desert. Rivers vanished. The animals that humans relied on disappeared one after another. You know how you feel when your favorite local restaurant closes and you have no idea where to get your comfort food anymore? Multiply that panic by about 1,000. Because for them, it wasn't about losing pad thai takeout. It was about losing actual survival. No water, no animals, no food. just the crushing emptiness of a continent turning unlivable. Most human groups didn't make it. They vanished, leaving behind no bones, no stories, no legacy. That's the eerie part. For hundreds of thousands of years, there's almost nothing in the fossil record. Scientists call it the fossil gap. And it makes sense. When there are barely more than 1,000 humans alive, the odds of any of them dying in just the right conditions to leave behind fossils are basically non-existent. It's like trying to find a single dropped French fry in the parking lot of a stadium after a game. Possible, but good luck. But somehow, one tiny group made it through. Maybe they found a refuge near a river that kept flowing when others dried up. Maybe they had better social bonds, sticking together when other groups fractured. Maybe they just got lucky. But whatever the reason, they endured. Year after year, century after century, generation after generation, through a 117,000-year-long nightmare, they held on, barely. And here's where the humor slips in, because when you picture this, it's tempting to imagine them as stoic warriors of survival. But honestly, they were probably just tired, hungry, annoyed at each other. Imagine being stuck with the same 30 people for your entire life, in freezing conditions, no Wi-Fi, no coffee. Somebody chewing too loudly around the fire probably sparked more drama than any mammoth hunt. And yet, somehow, through bickering and starvation and cold so sharp it froze rivers solid, they endured. If you want proof of how desperate it was, just look at the whispers of cannibalism in prehistoric records. Yes, some groups ate each other. That's the dark side. Not because they were monsters, but because hunger doesn't care about morals. And when survival is the only rule, things get complicated. But we'll get to that later, when the firelight flickers darker. For now, what matters is this. You are the descendant of survivors. Survivors of a bottleneck, so narrow, it's almost absurd that humanity didn't vanish completely. The reason you can lie in your bed right now, wrapped in a blanket burrito, scrolling your phone one last time before you drift off, is because 1,280 ragged, half-frozen, bug-eating humans didn't give up. So, breathe deep, feel the warmth of your own room, and remember, once, not that long ago, in the grand scale of time, the entire human species could have fit into a high school auditorium. And somehow, that was enough. Picture a world without neighbors in the modern sense. No busy streets, no apartment walls, so thin you can hear someone's late-night karaoke. No sprawling cities where millions of people move about anonymously. 900,000 years ago, humanity had been reduced to something almost laughably small. Microbands. Not micro as in cute, miniature humans with squeaky voices, but micro in terms of scale. Groups so tiny that if you sneeze too hard, you might double the daily sound output of the entire community. A band could be as few as 20 individuals, maybe 30 if they were lucky, and food was plentiful, which it rarely was. Imagine living your whole life, birth to death, with the same couple dozen people. Every face you see, every voice you hear, every joke you repeat has already been heard 1,000 times. There's no meeting someone new, except maybe once in a lifetime if your band happens to cross paths with another wandering group. It's less like a bustling society, and more like being permanently stuck on the worst group chat in history, except you can't leave, and the group admin is nature itself. They moved constantly. They didn't have the luxury of building permanent homes with nice porches and flower boxes. They wandered wherever there was water, wherever there were roots to dig, or animals to chase. Shelter was temporary, improvised. A shallow cave if you could find one, a lean-to of sticks and hides if you couldn't. And always the fire small, fragile, precious. The fire was less a cozy camp accessory and more like the Wi-Fi router of its time. If it went out, the whole operation collapsed. Without fire, nights stretched into hostile, freezing eternities, and predators considered you open buffet. The rhythm of life in a microband was defined by scarcity. Every morning started with questions that were never fully answered. Do we have water? Do we have food? Welly, do we have food? Welly, 2-2, Wailai, 2-2, 2-2-2. Is there enough wood to keep the fire alive tonight? If yes, you felt relief. If no, you packed up, trudged along icy ground, and prayed the horizon would offer better luck. Daily life wasn't about thriving. It was about holding on with fingernails dug into survival's cliff edge. And yet, there was intimacy in such closeness. In a group that small, you knew everyone's quirks. You knew who snored, who always found the best tubers, who had the sharpest eyes for animal tracks, and who couldn't resist hogging the warmest spot by the fire. Arguments had to be managed quickly because the group couldn't afford division. If two people were fighting, it wasn't just drama. It could jeopardize hunting coordination or fire tending. Imagine modern family Thanksgiving squabbles, but stretched across every day of the year, with no football game or pie to distract you. Children grew up immersed in constant learning. Play was never just play. It was rehearsal for survival. A stick became a spear in training. Mimicking an elder, digging in the dirt became the blueprint for future foraging. Kids didn't get the luxury of being kids for long. By the age of 10, you were expected to contribute. Maybe you couldn't bring down a deer, but you could dig up roots, carry water, keep an eye out for snakes. The chores list was non-negotiable. Childhood was short, adulthood was long and hard, and elderhood, if you reached it, was almost mythic. If someone made it to 40, they were a walking library of survival tips, a living archive, and survival depended on sharing knowledge. In microbands, information was as precious as calories. Where was the last water source? Which plants could poison you? Which cracks in the earth might hide edible roots? If a person died without passing along their knowledge, it wasn't just a sad loss. It could doom the group. Oral tradition wasn't about myths at this point. It was about recipes for not dying. So bedtime stories weren't about princesses or dragons. They were about the time your uncle almost ate the wrong berries and spent 2 days regretting every decision that led him there. You might imagine that with so few people, things would be peaceful, but tension always simmered. Food was scarce, tempers ran short, and you couldn't exactly take a walk to cool off when the nearest neighbor band was 100 miles away. You had to keep talking, keep cooperating, or, failing that, you just glared silently across the fire, plotting to steal their share of roasted beetles later. Cooperation was the only glue strong enough to keep such fragile groups from fracturing. And even then, fractures happened. When groups split, it wasn't dramatic like a divorce. It was deadly. 2 smaller groups meant fewer hands to forage, fewer eyes to spot predators, fewer bodies for warmth. If your microband became a nanoband, your odds of making it to spring plummeted. Now, let's talk about what they were actually living for, because every desperate trek, every icy night, every whispered argument came down to one pressing issue: food, the diet of desperation. And I use the word diet loosely here, because there was no structured menu, no paleo plan, ironically based on their reality. It was simple. Eat whatever, didn't kill you immediately, If you've ever stood in front of your fridge at 2 a.m., sighing that there's nothing to eat, congratulations, you've experienced 1/1,000,000th of their daily despair. Except your fridge actually contains food, and theirs contained mostly bark. Bugs were the go-to snack. Termites, crickets, beetle larvae, protein-rich, abundant, and always available if you could stomach them. And you would stomach them because hunger is the best seasoning. Imagine a child today turning up their nose at broccoli. Now imagine a prehistoric mother saying, "Eat your termites, Kevin, or you'll starve." Termites were little walking protein bars, and they didn't require chasing across frozen plains. They just required digging into rotten logs and crunching through the disgust. Roots and tubers came next. Hard, fibrous, buried deep in frozen ground. They didn't taste good. Raw, most were bitter. Some were toxic, unless cooked. But once roasted over a fire, they became edible. Not delicious, not Instagram-worthy, but edible. Picture gnawing on something halfway between a potato and a block of cardboard, and you're in the ballpark. Bark was another fallback. Stripped from trees, ground into fibrous chunks, chewed to extract even the faintest trace of calories. It was desperate stuff. If you've ever chewed on a popsicle stick until it splintered, you've basically reenacted prehistoric dinner. And then, of course, meat. Rare, precious, and risky. Hunting large animals required coordination and tools sharp enough to actually pierce thick hides. Even then, a failed hunt could leave the band exhausted, injured, and still starving. Opportunism was key. An old or injured animal meant a feast. A carcass left by predators could mean fighting hyenas for scraps. They took what they could, when they could, and when they couldn't, well, the rumors whisper darker things. Cannibalism, not a casual Tuesday activity, not a cultural ritual as in later societies, but a grim fallback. Archaeological evidence hints at bones with cut marks suggesting butchering. And while it's grim to imagine, you have to frame it in context. Survival wasn't abstract. If the choice was between feeding your children and starving together, some bands made choices we'd rather not picture. The human body in that frozen world was both a member of the community and, in desperate times, a last resource. It's a horrifying thought from our perspective, but to them, morality bent beneath the weight of hunger. Still, most of the time, the diet stayed on the side of bugs, roots, and whatever small animals they could trap. Rabbits, birds, fish, when they were lucky enough to catch them. Every calorie counted. Every chew of a bitter root was one more heartbeat, one more step forward. And sometimes, just sometimes, fortune smiled. A honeycomb, stumbled upon, sweet, golden relief. A berry bush, with actual, edible fruit, instead of poisonous imposters. Those moments must have felt like winning the lottery. Not because it tasted good, but because it meant one night of full stomachs, and maybe, just maybe, laughter around the fire. The diet of desperation forged the human body. It taught us flexibility. We became generalists, able to eat almost anything, able to survive almost anywhere. That's the legacy of eating termites and chewing bark. Not glamorous, not appetizing, but enduring. And in the dead of night, when the fire was small and the wind was howling, a belly full of beetles could be the difference between death and another sunrise. So next time you complain about your bland salad or sigh Because the restaurant gave you fries instead of sweet potato fries. Remember, your ancestors ate bugs, bark, and sometimes each other. And you are here because of it. Cannibalism is one of those words that immediately makes people sit up a little straighter. It has a built-in chill, the kind of thing you don't expect to hear in a bedtime story. But here you are, tucked under your blanket, and I'm about to explain why, for a time, it was part of the survival toolkit. Don't worry, though I'll be gentle, and you're safe. The only thing you might nibble tonight is a midnight snack if you wander to the kitchen. And yes, this story does get dark, but it's also strangely human, and if you tilt your head, it can even be a little funny. Because survival sometimes pushes people to choices that, looking back, are both horrifying and oddly practical. Archaeological sites in Europe and Africa have shown bones with cut marks, scrapes along shin bones, and skulls that aren't the work of animals. They're the unmistakable evidence of butchery. Humans processing humans. It wasn't about gourmet dining. No prehistoric cook ever said, "Ah yes, I think thigh pairs well with a nice root mash." It wasn't Hannibal Lecter with wine and candlelight. It was pure desperation. Imagine sitting with your group in a frozen cave, the fire smouldering low, everyone weak with hunger, and outside the snow, so deep, it muffles every sound. There are no berries, no insects, no unlucky rabbits crossing your path, just hunger clawing at your stomach. In that silence, the idea of eating what's left of a deceased band member wasn't appetizing, it was survival math. One body could mean a few more weeks of life for a group. And here's the soothing part. It wasn't rampant. Cannibalism wasn't the default menu. It was an emergency button, one that no one wanted to press, but sometimes had to. Think of it like the prehistoric equivalent of breaking the glass on the fire alarm. Nobody wanted to smash it, but if the building was going down, you did what you had to do. And when you look at it that way, it's less about horror and more about humans refusing to give up no matter what. Humor finds its way in here too. Picture the awkwardness of the situation. Someone's cousin is gone, and suddenly people are side-eyeing each other with a thought nobody wants to say out loud. The silence stretches, the fire flickers, and eventually somebody clears their throat and suggests that maybe, just maybe, this isn't the time to be squeamish. We laugh now because it's unthinkable. But if you were one of those 1,280 survivors in the bottleneck of human history, it might have been the only thing standing between you and extinction. Scientists debate whether cannibalism was purely starvation-driven or whether it sometimes had ritual meaning, a way of absorbing the strength of the dead. Personally, I suspect ritual probably came later, when people had the energy to get creative about symbolism. In the bottleneck times, it was about calories, plain and simple. And remember, calories weren't just energy for today. They were warmth through the night, clarity of thought, strength for tomorrow's hunt. Calories were survival currency. And sometimes they came from grim places. The thing to hold on to as you drift towards sleep is that cannibalism is less about the act itself and more about the refusal to let the fire of life go out. They made choices that kept their children alive, that bought time until the climate eased or food was found. You are here because, at some point in your family tree, somebody made a decision that looks monstrous to us now, but was simply practical in their world. The dark side of humanity is also the determined side, and there's something oddly comforting in that. Even in the bleakest times, when nature had stripped away everything else, they found ways to keep going. That, in its own way, is a lullaby. Grim, yes, but also proof of human resilience. And resilience had another trick up its sleeve. one that changed everything. Because, while cannibalism was a desperate, temporary measure, fire was the opposite. Fire was hope. Fire was a turning point that transformed desperation into possibility. Imagine the first sparks. Maybe it was lightning hitting a tree, setting the branches ablaze. Early humans gathered close, mesmerized. The flames danced, flickered, devoured wood, and spat out warmth. At first, fire was terrifying, a thing to avoid. But then, curiosity won out, as it always does with us. They realized that if you kept a branch burning, carried it carefully, you could take fire with you, protect it, feed it. And suddenly, for the first time, people weren't just at the mercy of the cold. They had a weapon against it. The first controlled fires weren't roaring bonfires, they were fragile, smoky affairs, fed by twigs and guarded like treasure. People learned quickly that fire demanded care. Too much wood, too fast, and it smothered. Too little, and it died. It needed watching through the night. Someone always had the job of tending it, poking it, blowing gently on the embers to coax life from the ashes. Fire became a member of the band, a living presence. You didn't just sit by it, you depended on it as much as you did each other. And what fire gave was miraculous. Warmth, of course, that invisible blanket wrapping your body when the world outside was brutal. But more than that, fire kept predators at bay. Wolves, lions, hyenas, they hesitated at the glowing edge of the camp. For the first time, humans weren't just prey. They had a circle of protection that glowed in the dark. Then came cooking. Food that was once barely edible became softer, safer, richer in nutrients. Tubers that had been bitter and tough transformed into starchy fuel. Meat became easier to chew, less likely to carry parasites. Suddenly, those beetles and scraps of bark weren't just things you tolerated. They became part of a cuisine, if you can call it that. Fire was the original Michelin star. But maybe the most important gift fire offered was time. Before fire, darkness meant paralysis. You huddled, you waited, you prayed for dawn. With fire, night stretched open. People could sit together, share stories, teach, plan, laugh. Fire turned evenings from silent terror into community. It was the prehistoric Netflix, drawing everyone to its glow. And you can imagine the jokes. Someone throws too much green wood on and fills the cave with smoke. Someone else tries to roast a bug and drops it in the flames. Everyone laughing at the tiny puff of smoke, like a tragic barbecue accident. Humor thrives around warmth, and fire made space for it. So as you lie here, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, picture those first fires. Picture the relief of warmth seeping into frozen hands, the glow reflected in eyes that had only ever known darkness. Picture the way flames drew people together, the way shadows flickered on the walls as stories were told, the way laughter could finally ring out, even in a world that had been so bleak. Fire was hope made visible. Cannibalism might have kept people alive from one desperate week to the next, but fire gave them a future. It gave them a chance not just to survive, but to begin imagining more than just the next mouthful of food. And in that gentle glow, humanity found its way forward. So tonight, as your eyelids grow heavy, remember this: you carry in you the resilience of ancestors who made unthinkable choices, and the spark of hope that fire first offered. The dark and the light, the hunger and the warmth, both sides of the story, woven into the human heart. When you imagine survival in the deep prehistoric past, It's easy to picture it as a contest of muscle. Huge hunters with arms like tree trunks, spears clenched in fists, standing tall against mammoths and lions. But the truth is far softer, quieter, and strangely familiar. What really kept humanity alive wasn't brute strength, it was cooperation. It was the invisible threads of trust, sharing, and care that bound people together, even when the wind outside threatened to strip everything away. Think about it. In a world where your entire society was 20 or 30 individuals, strength was useful, but not enough. A strong person could carry more wood or bring down a rabbit. But if they got sick or tripped and twisted an ankle on the rocky ground, strength alone collapsed. What kept them alive was everyone else, friends, family, and even that one grumpy uncle who complained about everything but still knew how to set snares. A person alone in the Ice Age wasn't a rugged survivor. They were dinner for wolves. But a group, bound by cooperation, could outlast even the hardest winters. It's strangely comforting to realize that humans survived not because we were the fastest, strongest, or even the smartest at that time, but because we were the best at teamwork. We learned early on that helping one another was the only path forward. Someone gathered firewood while another watched the children. One person wove plant fibers into rope while another sharpened flint. You didn't have specialization in the modern sense, but you had division of labor. Even back then, "I'll do this while you do that" was a survival strategy. Cooperation stretched beyond chores. It was about empathy. A child who lagged behind wasn't abandoned, but carried. An elder with aching joints wasn't discarded, but listened to, because their memory of where rivers flowed in drought years might mean the difference between life and death. Caring for one another wasn't charity, it was insurance. The kindness you gave today might circle back when you needed it tomorrow. Humor was part of this glue too. Imagine the endless repetition of cold, hunger, and struggle. Without laughter, despair could hollow people out. So they teased one another. They joked about who snored loudest, who fell in the river last week, who tried to cook a root and ended up setting it on fire. The laughter didn't change the reality, but it softened the edges. It reminded everyone that life, even when cruel, still had moments worth smiling at. In fact, laughter itself may have been a survival trait. Try being angry while laughing, it's nearly impossible. Jokes disarmed tension, soothed conflicts, and turned frustration into something livable. In a group that small, one bad fight could fracture everything. Humor was as important as a spear point, and maybe even sharper in the long run. When archaeologists study prehistoric remains, they often find healed fractures in bones. That means someone broke a leg or an arm, but survived long enough to heal. Alone, that would have been impossible. A broken leg meant no hunting, no foraging, no escaping predators. But with a group, someone else carried food. Someone else defended you. Someone else waited while you hobbled behind. These healed bones are fossils of kindness, proof written in calcium that cooperation kept humanity alive. If strength had been the rule, our ancestors would have died with the first serious injury. But because of social bonds, they endured. That endurance is in you now. Every time you lean on a friend or help someone without expecting a reward, you're echoing that prehistoric instinct. Not because it's noble, but because it's survival. The fact that you exist, that you can drift towards sleep tonight, is because long ago, people understood that togetherness was stronger than muscle. And together, they moved through each day, repeating routines that seem dull now, but were the heartbeat of survival. Daily life wasn't glamorous. It wasn't epic battles or dramatic hunts every day. Most of the time, it was monotony, the kind of monotony that kept you alive. Waking with the first light, checking the embers of the fire, blowing gently on them until the orange glow sparked back to life. Someone fetched water if any was nearby, breaking ice from a frozen stream, scooping snow into a crude vessel to melt later. Breakfast wasn't pancakes or bacon. It was whatever was left from yesterday. Maybe roasted roots, maybe dried scraps of meat. Then came the endless search. Food didn't wait in cupboards. It didn't hum quietly in refrigerators. It had to be found. Every single day. People spread out, scanning the ground for tracks, turning over logs for insects, digging with sticks for tubers. Sometimes they got lucky and stumbled on berries or a small animal caught in a snare. Sometimes they found nothing and returned empty-handed, stomachs groaning in protest. Hunger was a constant companion, always at the edge of camp like a stray dog. Water was another obsession. Streams froze, rivers shrank, rains failed. Knowing where to dig, which direction to walk, how to read the signs of moisture in soil, all of this was vital. It was knowledge passed down like treasure. If someone remembered a spring a few miles east, the band would pack up and go, dragging their few possessions, hoping it hadn't dried out. Thirst was more dangerous than hunger. You could chew bark and insects to hold off starvation for days, but without water, the body gave up quickly. Shelter came next. If you were lucky, you found a cave. If you weren't, you built something with branches and hides. Nothing fancy, just enough to block the wind. It never felt like comfort in the modern sense. There was no door to lock, no insulation to trap warmth, just layers of improvisation. But when the blizzard came, even a flimsy wall made the difference between life and death. The day revolved around tasks like these, repeated endlessly. Fetch wood, keep the fire alive, check traps, forage, patch hides, care for children. Each task small, almost boring, yet each was essential. If someone forgot or gave up, the whole band suffered. It was like living inside one giant group project, with no option to quit. And while group projects today can be frustrating, this one had the highest possible stakes. By dusk, the day's harvest was gathered and shared. Nobody hoarded. If one person tried to eat in secret, the group's survival balance cracked. Sharing was non-negotiable, the law older than any written rule. The fire was fed again, smoke curling into the twilight, and people huddled close. Stories were told, knowledge passed on. Children listened wide-eyed as elders explained which plants healed wounds and which ones killed. A joke might ripple through the circle, someone mimicking a clumsy hunter or teasing a friend's smoke-smeared face. And then the darkness deepened, and they curled together under hides, knowing tomorrow would repeat the same rhythm. The beauty of these routines is that they built resilience. Repetition became strength. The monotony was security. Survival wasn't about one grand gesture, but thousands of tiny, almost invisible acts done every day. The fire tended, the water carried, the roots dug, the jokes told. Each routine, a brick in the wall, against extinction. As you breathe steadily now, sinking deeper into the warmth of your own bed, you can almost hear the echoes of those days. The crunch of feet in snow, the scrape of sticks digging for tubers, the soft crackle of firewood. They lived in rhythms that lulled even them into sleep, despite the cold, despite the hunger. And you, many centuries later, carry those rhythms inside you still. Cooperation bound them, Routines sustained them, and both together carried humanity through the bottleneck of time. There's something both grim and oddly funny about inevitability. Prehistoric life was full of it. Hunger was inevitable. Cold nights were inevitable. Blisters on your feet from trudging across frozen mud. Inevitable. And sometimes, the inevitability was so heavy that humor became the only way to handle it. It's a habit we still have, laughing at things we can't change, like taxes, traffic, or the fact that your phone always dies right before you need it most. Our ancestors had their own dark comedy routines, though theirs usually didn't involve smartphones or rush hour. Imagine sitting in a freezing shelter 900,000 years ago, the fires barely flickering. You're gnawing on a root that tastes like wood shavings, and someone in the group mutters something like, "Well, at least we won't get fat." And suddenly, in the middle of despair, people laugh. It's not that the situation is funny, it's that humor takes the sting out of inevitability. It transforms a bleak reality into something you can survive another hour with. Now, if you were to time travel back to those nights and try explaining DoorDash to them, you'd probably be laughed right out of the group. Imagine trying to explain, "So, in the future, when you're hungry, you don't walk for 3 days to find a rabbit. You just press buttons on a glowing rock, and someone delivers hot food to your door in less than an hour." They'd stare at you like you just declared the sun rises because of your personal magic. And then, after a beat, they'd probably make a joke about whether these food messengers also accept payment in beetle larvae. The inevitability of hunger was such a constant that it became woven into the humor of their lives. You might think of gallows humor, but really, it was more like cooking jokes without the cooking. Someone burns their hand on the fire? Inevitability. Someone falls asleep and snores so loudly predators might hear. Inevitability. The key was to laugh about it, because laughter turned inevitability into endurance. Humor also kept conflict at bay. When you're trapped with the same 20 people every day of your life, jokes about inevitability smoothed over the tension. "Of course it's snowing again," someone might say sarcastically, pulling their hide tighter. Or, "Well, at least the lice will stay warm tonight." These small, sarcastic remarks helped keep the band together. You didn't need a stand-up comedian. The environment itself supplied the material. What's striking is how little that instinct has changed. Today, we laugh about the inevitability of bills, or that every time you pick the shortest line at the grocery store, it turns out to be the slowest. They laughed about frostbite and starvation. We both laugh because deep down, we know there are things we can't control. Humor doesn't erase them, but it makes them less crushing. And in between these jokes, knowledge was being passed down. Because while inevitability was funny, ignorance wasn't. Ignorance killed. That's where children came in. Teaching wasn't just an afterthought, it was a daily survival ritual. Children were walking sponges, absorbing everything they could, because their future depended on it. You didn't go to school in the morning with a backpack and lunchbox. School was every waking moment. A child watched their mother dig for roots and learned the subtle signs of which soil hid edible tubers and which soil would break your teeth on useless rocks. They watched their father set a trap and memorized how high the snare was tied, how tight the knot. Even play was instruction. Little ones threw pebbles to practice their aim, wrestled each other to build strength, mimicked the adults in mock hunts. Every action was rehearsal for the day when play stopped and survival began. The teaching wasn't gentle in the way we think of it today, with patient encouragement and gold stars. It was urgent. Don't touch that plant. It will kill you. Blow too hard on the embers, and you'll scatter them. Step too close to the edge of the river ice, and you'll drown. These weren't abstract lessons. They were shouted into the cold air, with a desperation born of knowing mistakes had consequences you couldn't undo. And yet, there must have been softer moments too. Around the fire at night, children listened wide-eyed to stories. Some were warnings wrapped in narrative, tales of the boy who ignored his elders and wandered too far, only to be taken by a predator. Some were lessons dressed up as entertainment, how the clever woman tricked a lion by setting a fire. Others were pure humor stories of clumsy hunters falling face first into the mud, retold so often that children laughed until they cried. These stories weren't written in books. They were etched into memory, carried like invisible heirlooms. The beauty of teaching in those days was that it wasn't a choice. Everyone participated. The old taught the young watched the old, and survival knowledge flowed like an unbroken chain. Even when populations dwindled to a handful, the chain remained intact. That's why we're here, because those children didn't just play in the dirt, they learned. They learned to read tracks in snow, to smell when water was near, to hear the subtle difference between the rustle of wind and the rustle of prey. Knowledge was currency, more valuable than food itself, because food disappeared quickly, but knowledge could produce more food tomorrow. Teaching also bonded the group together. Children weren't raised by parents alone. Everyone had a role. An elder too frail to forage could still point out safe plants or tell a child how to sharpen flint. A teenager just learning to hunt could pass on skills to the ones too small to hold a spear. The web of teaching stretched across the whole band, and in doing so, it reinforced the very cooperation that kept them alive. You can imagine the pride of a parent watching a child successfully light a fire for the first time, or the relief when a child correctly remembered which berries were edible. These weren't milestones celebrated with cupcakes, they were celebrated with survival. Every successful lesson meant another life, secured against the cold indifference of nature. Of course, children sometimes failed. They made mistakes, they got things wrong, and in those moments, humor softened the blow. A boy tripping over his own snare might be scolded, yes, but also laughed at, teased, in a way that etched the lesson deeper without crushing his spirit. Humor and teaching were intertwined, one turning inevitability into a joke, the other turning mistakes into wisdom. So, as you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, you can picture it clearly. A child crouched by a fire, eyes wide, as an elder explains how to blow gently on embers. Another child trying to balance a stick like a spear, wobbling, but learning. Laughter rippling through the group as someone retells the story of the time an overconfident hunter got chased up a tree by a very unimpressed boar. Knowledge and humor, inevitability and survival, woven together like fibers of rope, stronger than any single strand. And the reason you're here, safe in your warm bed, is because that chain of teaching never broke. Because every generation, from the ones who joked about inevitability in the freezing dark to the ones who told bedtime warnings beside the fire, passed their knowledge forward. You are the end result of that chain. And just as humor once softened hunger, and lessons once sharpened survival, now they both soothe you as you close your eyes. When scientists talk about the genetic bottleneck, it sounds clinical, almost like something you'd hear at a conference with too many PowerPoint slides. But what it really means is that our DNA is still carrying the scars of a near-death experience that lasted for over 100,000 years. Imagine your entire family tree squeezing through the eye of a needle, and when it finally wriggles out the other side, most of the branches are gone. That's what happened to humanity. At one point, there were barely more than 1,000 breeding individuals alive on the planet. 1,000. That's fewer people than you'd find in a crowded IKEA cafeteria on a Saturday afternoon. So what did that do to our DNA? For starters, it made us suspiciously similar to one another. Compared to chimpanzees, who live scattered in small groups across Africa, modern humans are genetic twins. You might think you're completely different from the stranger sitting across from you on the subway, but genetically, you're closer than two random chimpanzees who might never meet. We lost a huge chunk of genetic diversity in that bottleneck, like someone went through the library of humanity and burned 2/3 of the books. The shelves are still there, but the selection is limited. This loss explains some of our quirks. Why do humans get knocked flat by viruses that barely bother other animals? It's because our immune system doesn't have as many backup blueprints as it should. When our ancestors were reduced to so few, all the rare variants that might have given resistance to certain diseases were simply lost. Poof. Gone forever. We've been working with a reduced toolkit ever since. It's like trying to build IKEA furniture with half the screws missing. You can still get it done, but don't lean too hard on the bookshelf. Some of our genetic baggage also stuck around longer than you'd expect. Disorders like Huntington's disease or sickle cell anemia, conditions that natural selection would normally sweep away, managed to linger. Why? Because when you've only got 1,000 people keeping the lights on, genetic quirks spread fast. If one person in that tiny group had a mutation, it didn't take long before everybody carried it. Imagine sitting at a potluck where everyone brings the same dish. By the end of the night, all you've got is potato salad. That's what happened to our genes. Lots of potato salad, not much variety. On the flip side, some of these quirks may have been helpful. There's a theory that the infamous chromosome fusion, the one that gave us 46 chromosomes instead of 48, like chimps and gorillas, happened right in the middle of this bottleneck. Normally, a mutation like that would just get lost in the crowd. But when the crowd is tiny, even strange traits can go viral. That fusion might have changed the way our brains developed, nudging us toward bigger, more complex thinking. So while it sounds dramatic to say your whole species almost died out, it may also be the reason you're clever enough to be lying in bed, listening to a soothing story instead of chewing bark by a frozen river. And if you're feeling cozy right now, remember, all of your ancestors who survived were the adaptable ones, the cooperative ones, the slightly weird but resilient ones. That's your inheritance. Every time you laugh, every time you cooperate with someone, every time you invent a clever shortcut, you're echoing the traits that slipped through that genetic needle. You are living proof of survival against astronomical odds, carrying DNA that was tested in fire, cold, and starvation. Even if you don't feel special, your chromosomes are basically little trophies, each one stamped with, "Congratulations, you didn't go extinct." But if genetics gave us resilience, nights gave us fear. Picture this. The fire has burned low. Shadows dance on the walls of a cave. Outside, the night is a wall of blackness, thick and endless. No streetlights, no glow of distant towns, just stars and the kind of silence that vibrates in your chest. And then, a noise, a low growl, or the snap of a twig. Every head lifts, every ear strains, because out there could be a predator, or worse, the unknown. Superstition was inevitable in a world like that. People filled the darkness with stories, to explain the noises, to calm the children, and maybe even to calm themselves. A rustle outside might become a spirit wandering through the night. The moan of the wind became a warning from ancestors. Shadows weren't just shadows, they were figures watching, testing, sometimes helping, sometimes hunting. And while we don't have written records from 900,000 years ago, we can be sure that humans told stories. They had to. Stories gave shape to fear. Around the fire, the day's work gave way to whispers. Someone might tell of a creature that prowled the hills, half human, half beast, punishing anyone who wandered too far from the group. A parent might hush a restless child with tales of the moon spirit who loved quiet camps. Fear became narrative, and narrative became tradition. In those flickering moments, imagination was as much a tool as flint or fire. It helped children remember the dangers without needing a lecture. It gave adults a way to laugh nervously about the unknown. Predators were real enough. Lions larger than the ones today, bears with shoulders like moving boulders, hyenas that cracked bones, with jaws powerful enough to shatter. Their noises at night weren't just spooky, they were signals that death was near. But wrapping those sounds in stories made them less paralyzing. If the growl belonged to a spirit, you could bargain with it. If the shriek was the voice of an ancestor, maybe it was a warning, not just a random terror. Stories turned raw fear into something you could talk about. And fear itself wasn't all bad. It kept people close to the fire, close to one another. It kept children from wandering into the night. It made groups more vigilant, more cooperative. In a strange way, fear was another survival trait, one that sharpened the senses and bound communities together. Humor crept into this too. Imagine someone snoring so loudly that the group mistakes it for a predator growl. Once the panic dies down, the laughter would be enormous. The next night, that person becomes the punchline of jokes, everyone mimicking the sound while children giggle. The fear transforms into shared amusement, proof that even in the face of danger, people found ways to laugh. As the firelight flickered, stories mixed with reality. Knowledge passed through superstition. A tale about a beast in the forest reminded listeners to never sleep without checking snares. A ghost story about someone who drowned in a river taught children to respect the current. Lessons wrapped in shadows, guidance disguised as fear. So tonight, as you close your eyes, think of those two legacies. The quiet fingerprints left in your DNA by the bottleneck, and the soft, trembling voices of your ancestors telling stories by firelight. One is written in your chromosomes, the other in the timeless rhythm of imagination. Both remind you that humanity is a creature of survival and of story, of science and of superstition, of fear and of humor. You are the heir to all of it, lying safe in the glow of a modern fire, drifting toward dreams, while outside the night is calm. It's tempting to picture prehistoric life as nothing but grim endurance, a never-ending grey canvas of cold nights and hungry days. But that's only half the story. Even in the darkest winters, laughter found a way to slip between the cracks. Humor wasn't a luxury, it was a survival mechanism. Because if you couldn't laugh when someone slipped on a patch of ice, you'd drown in despair. And people did slip. A lot. Imagine trudging along on frost-hardened ground, the weight of a hide cloak dragging at your shoulders, and suddenly your foot hits a sheen of frozen mud. Down you go, arms flailing, landing flat on your back, with the sort of thud that echoes through the camp. Everyone freezes for a moment, waiting to see if you're injured. But when you groan, roll over, and mutter something that translates roughly into, "I hate winter," the group erupts. Laughter ripples through the band, children giggling, even the elders shaking with mirth. For just a few minutes, hunger and cold are pushed aside by hilarity. And the poor soul who fell, they're not angry. They're relieved, because in that laughter is proof we are still human. Family arguments could also be funny in retrospect, though not always at the time. Imagine a father insisting that the firewood pile is fine, it doesn't need to be stacked differently, and a mother glaring because she knows the angle is wrong, and snow will drift in. Voices rise. Children roll their eyes. The elders mutter about kids these days. Sound familiar? The arguments we have now about chores, about where to park the car or how to load the dishwasher, were happening then too. Just swap the dishwasher for firewood. And inevitably, once tempers cooled, the fight turned into a joke. The story of the great firewood debate would be retold for weeks, with exaggerated voices and dramatic gestures, until even the arguers laughed. Children especially were fountains of humor. Little ones trying to copy adults often created slapstick worthy of a comedy reel. Picture a boy, determined to carry a log twice his size, wobbling like a drunk goose, finally tipping backward into the snow, or a girl proudly announcing she has found berries, only for everyone to discover she's dragged back a fistful of inedible leaves. Laughter followed these mishaps, not to shame, but to bond. The mistakes became entertainment, the stories became traditions, and the humor softened the edges of a brutal world. It's easy to forget how powerful Laughter Island, but in a group of 20, when fear and hunger are constant, a single joke could lift everyone. Humor was the lightest tool in the survival kit, but sometimes the most necessary. The echoes of that laughter, those slapstick tumbles and family quarrels, still resonate in us. That's why you chuckle when someone spills coffee, even though you know it's messy. That's why you smirk when a toddler insists on doing something all by myself and then topples over. It's prehistoric programming. We laugh because it helps us survive the inevitabilities of life. And sometimes, survival offered more than laughter. Sometimes, against all odds, luck dropped a feast into their laps. Imagine weeks of scraping by on roots and insects. Every meal has been the same grey-brown monotony. Your stomach feels like it's gnawing on itself. And then fortune strikes. A deer caught in a trap, or an animal weakened by cold, staggering and easy to bring down. Suddenly, there's meat. Not a sliver, not scraps, but an abundance. The group gathers around, eyes wide, salivating, hands trembling as the carcass is prepared. The fire crackles louder that night, flames fed by the promise of fullness. The smell alone must have been intoxicating. Fat dripping into flames, sizzling, popping. Children bouncing with excitement, elders grinning toothless smiles. It wasn't just about calories, it was about celebration. The rare feast was a reminder that life wasn't only struggle. Sometimes, it surprised you with generosity. Honey was another miracle. Imagine stumbling on a beehive, the golden treasure hidden inside. Of course, it came with the small inconvenience of angry bees. Picture a group of half-naked, shivering humans batting at swarms, while one brave soul gouges honeycomb from the hive. There are shrieks, frantic running, laughter through the pain. And then, the reward. Thick, sticky, sweetness. Unlike anything else they tasted all year. Children's faces smeared with honey, adults humming with pleasure, everyone licking fingers until nothing was left. For a night, the bitterness of roots was forgotten. Fish runs too could bring plenty. A river suddenly thick, with silvery bodies leaping against the current. Spears flashing, hands grabbing, shouts of triumph echoing off stone banks. For hours the band would gorge, bellies full for once, fire hissing as wet fish roasted on sticks. It wasn't fine dining, but it was abundance, and abundance was rare. These feasts weren't just about food, they were about memory. People told stories of them for years. Remember the time the deer stumbled into camp? Remember when your uncle got stung 20 times, but we had honey for weeks? These became the family lore. The tales retold by firelight, on hungry nights, to remind everyone that fortune could strike again. And if you think about it, that's what kept them going. The promise of another feast, another burst of laughter, another day when inevitability gave way to luck. Life wasn't only starvation and fear, it was also sweetness on the tongue, warmth in the belly, jokes that made the cold night bearable. Tonight, as you drift into sleep, imagine both sides, the laughter echoing from a clumsy fall, the groans of family arguments that turned into jokes, and the sudden joy of a feast when the world handed over its treasures. These are the rhythms that carried humanity through the bottleneck. Not strength alone, not suffering alone, but humor and celebration woven through the bleakness. And you carry those echoes still, in your laughter, in your celebrations, in your stories. There is a kind of silence in history that cannot be measured by sound. It is the silence of lives that ended without witnesses, of small groups who vanished so completely that only the wind remembers their names. In the Ice Age world of 900,000 years ago, these silences were everywhere. For every band of survivors that huddled around a stubborn fire, another band succumbed quietly, their traces lost beneath snow and soil. We know this not because we found their bones most never left a trace, but because if humanity's population shrank to the size of a small village, then countless others must have slipped away into extinction. Imagine a group of 20 wandering along a frozen riverbank. Their firewood is gone, their food supplies dwindled to nothing but bark and bitter roots. The children are too weak to walk. One by one, the adults slow their steps, breath clouding in the air, until the group finally collapses in a shallow cave. There is no dramatic ending, no cinematic farewell, just a slow drifting into stillness, each body giving up against the weight of cold and hunger. Within days, predators scavenge what remains, scattering bones. Within weeks, snow buries the rest. Within months, even the memory is erased. Silence. That silence is haunting, but it is also strangely comforting, because every human alive today is descended from the groups that did not fall into silence. The fact that you are breathing right now means that in your long chain of ancestors, someone kept walking, kept digging, kept coaxing sparks into flame. Somewhere, in the vast frozen wilderness, another group endured where others didn't. The thought might sound grim, but there is also a dry humor in it, the kind that comes with perspective. Consider this. Our ancestors were essentially the winners of the most brutal survival lottery ever conducted. Billions of people exist now, but all of us are descendants of the same sliver of humanity that didn't give up. Everyone else, every unlucky group that collapsed, lost their ticket. If you could step back and watch the human story unfold, you might imagine some ancient commentator saying, well, Group A didn't pack enough firewood. Group B thought they could out-hike a blizzard. But Group C, now they've figured out how to stay warm with heated stones under the blankets. Place your bets. It is a cold comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. The reality of those silent deaths also shaped the survivors. When you live in a world where groups disappear quietly in the night, the fear becomes part of your bones. You learn to prepare obsessively. You overcollect firewood, even if it breaks your back. You overteach your children, repeating lessons until they roll their eyes, because you know ignorance kills. You huddle closer, share more, argue less, because you've seen what happens when a group falls apart. In this way, the vanished still spoke, even if they had no words. Their absence was a warning. But silence was not the whole story, because even as groups vanished, others adapted, and out of desperation came sparks of ingenuity, little bursts of creativity that turned survival into something more than luck. The first tools had been simple, sharp rocks used for cutting, sticks used for digging. But under the pressure of the bottleneck, tools became lifelines. Every improvement, no matter how small, rippled through the group's survival chances. A sharper flake meant meat stripped faster before predators arrived. A better spear tip meant one successful hunt instead of another empty-handed day. Tools were no longer conveniences. They were extensions of human will. You can almost picture the moment when someone discovered that striking certain stones together created not just shards, but predictably sharp edges. Imagine the joy, the pride, maybe even the smugness. "Look," they probably said with a grin, "this one's sharper than yours." And suddenly, cutting through hide didn't take an hour of sawing, but a few clean strokes. What had been tedious became efficient. In an age when every calorie counted, efficiency was life. Fire management itself was a tool. The ability to keep embers alive for days by burying them in ash or carrying them in bark containers was not instinct, but invention. Someone tried it first, perhaps by accident, and realized the value. Others copied. The idea spread, and with it, the margin of safety widened. Ingenuity multiplied. Survival. It wasn't only about sharpness or fire. Ingenuity appeared in how shelters were built. Instead of flimsy lean-tos, groups experimented with layering hides, banking snow against walls to trap heat, stacking stones to block wind. The first time someone shoved snow against the outside of a shelter, others may have laughed, "You're making it colder," until they felt the difference. That laugh turned into a lesson. Soon, everyone was copying the idea, passing it forward. Problem solving was constant. A snare that didn't work meant redesign. A water source that froze meant someone tried chiseling through ice with stone until they reached liquid. A broken spear shaft became two smaller tools. There was no waste, no laziness in thought. Every scrap of material begged to be tested for some new purpose. It is strangely soothing to realize that this tinkering spirit, this drive to solve problems under pressure, is what you carry in your DNA. Every time you figure out how to fix a jammed drawer with duct tape, or invent a new recipe with whatever's left in the fridge, you are echoing those ancient sparks. Their ingenuity did not vanish into silence, it lived, generation by generation, until it reached you. Of course, there was humor in invention too. Imagine a man proudly unveiling his new super spear, only for it to snap in half the first time he thrust it at a rabbit. Laughter would erupt, and the children would imitate his dramatic failure for weeks. But beneath the laughter was learning. Trial and error was embarrassing, but it was also progress. Sometimes ingenuity turned failure into comedy, and comedy into resilience. When you live on the edge of extinction, every improvement feels like a miracle, and every flop feels like a story worth retelling around the fire. And so the human spirit bounced between silence and spark, between groups lost without a trace, and groups who discovered something that tipped the balance. So as you lie in your bed tonight, you can hold both truths together, the silence of those who did not make it, haunting but respectful, and the sparks of ingenuity, that kept others alive. Both shaped who you are. You are built from absence and invention, from caution and curiosity. And as the fire of your ancestors once glowed against the darkness, your own life now glows against the silence of deep time. You are proof that the spark never went out. There's a question that lingers like smoke curling from an old fire. Why didn't they give up? When the world seemed set against them, when food was scarce, when every dawn was colder than the last, what made our ancestors keep dragging their feet forward instead of lying down in the snow and letting it all end? Sometimes, when you look at the fossil record, or the thin line of evidence left behind by people clinging to life in the bottleneck, the persistence almost looks unreasonable. Stubbornness seems to ooze from their very bones. Perhaps instinct was enough. Life wants to keep going, and every creature carries that program inside it, like a secret drumbeat. Survive, survive, survive. Even when logic would say otherwise, instinct shouts louder. You felt it in small ways yourself, holding your breath underwater a second too long, and your body forces you back to the surface with a gasp, whether you wanted to or not. For them, every day was that gasp, forced onward by bodies that refused to stop fighting. But instinct alone doesn't explain the scale of it. Plenty of other species went extinct in those same conditions. Whole lineages of animals disappeared, their skeletons sealed under ice. Our ancestors endured, and one can't help but suspect that stubbornness played its role. The same mule-headed determination you see when someone insists they can carry all 8 grocery bags at once, or when a toddler insists, "I do it myself," while making a spectacular mess. That streak of defiance was alive even then. They must have looked at the impossible odds and, without words, simply refused to yield. It wasn't elegant, and it wasn't pretty. It was more like grumbling at the cold and muttering, "Fine, I'll survive, but I won't like it." And then, there's the most human answer of all: luck, the cruel, arbitrary roll of the dice that scattered survival across the map. Maybe one group happened to find a valley that kept water flowing longer than others. Maybe they stumbled upon a herd of weakened animals at just the right time. Maybe their fire didn't go out when the snowstorm hit. For every band that perished, another might have been spared by chance. It's both humbling and ridiculous to imagine that you're here not because your ancestors were stronger or smarter, but because 900,000 years ago, someone got lucky with a snowbank. The reality is that all 3 forces braided together. Instinct kept their hearts beating, stubbornness kept their feet moving, and luck kept them from walking straight into oblivion. It's oddly reassuring, isn't it? You don't have to be a superhero to survive. Sometimes it's enough to keep putting one foot in front of the other, muttering complaints about the weather, and hoping fortune throws you a bone, or at least a half-frozen rabbit. But within that relentless trudging forward, something else was brewing. Seeds, tiny and fragile, that hinted at the humans yet to come. If you were to step into a campfire circle back then, you wouldn't see skyscraper architects or rocket scientists. You'd see gaunt faces, cracked hands, shaggy hair tangled with frost. And yet, in the way they sat close, in the way they shared scraps of food, you would glimpse the outlines of what we became. Cooperation was already their strongest tool. One person couldn't keep a fire alive all night, but 3 people taking turns could. One person couldn't hunt an animal larger than a rabbit, but 10 coordinated could bring down something worth feasting on for days. The spark of what would someday become nations and cities flickered there, in those cold little bands of 20. Intelligence, too, peeked through. The tools they shaped grew sharper, more efficient. The shelters they built grew sturdier, They experimented, adjusted, remembered. They taught their children not just how to copy, but how to understand which stones flaked best, which roots poisoned, which rivers froze slowest. This was more than instinct. It was curiosity. They asked questions with their hands, with their eyes, with the way they tilted their heads at the stars. The answers weren't always clear, but the asking was enough to move them forward. And even humor was a seed of the future. When someone slipped on ice and the whole camp burst into laughter, they weren't just easing tension, they were practicing the art of turning suffering into story. That impulse would grow, through millennia, into myths, into art, into novels, into the very story you're hearing now. The laughter of those half-starved ancestors is still rippling through time, cushioning you as you close your eyes. So yes, they survived because of instinct. Yes, they endured because of stubbornness. Yes, they persisted because of luck. But what carried them beyond mere survival were these seeds: cooperation, curiosity, and the strange ability to turn even disaster into story. They were still rough sketches of what we'd become, but the outlines were there. Picture them sitting around a low fire, sparks spiraling upward into the black sky. The children lean close, listening, as an elder tells of the time the river froze so thick that even mammoths could walk across. Everyone laughs at the part where a hunter slipped and flailed like a fish on the ice. Beneath the laughter, knowledge is being passed down. The river is dangerous when it freezes. The ice can betray you. Story, humor, and instruction wrapped together. That is the seed of culture. And tomorrow, those same children will help their parents build a sturdier windbreak because they noticed which side of the shelter stayed warmer last night. That is the seed of science. The next day, they'll share a meal with another band they meet, exchanging information about where the herds are moving. That is the seed of trade, of diplomacy, of the sprawling networks that would one day stretch across oceans. From the outside, it looks like just another group of ragged survivors trying to get through another night. But if you could zoom forward, you'd see the shadows of cities, the hum of airplanes, the glow of screens, all resting on those seeds. The seeds planted in cold soil, watered with instinct, fertilized with stubbornness, and sometimes, just sometimes, sprinkled with luck. As you breathe slowly now, drifting deeper into rest, you carry those seeds in you. Every cooperative gesture, every curious thought, every joke you tell in the face of frustration is proof that they didn't just survive. They became the blueprint for what we are. And the silence of all the groups that didn't make it makes their success even sharper, like stars shining against the black. So tonight, let yourself feel the strange mix of gratitude and wonder. Gratitude for the stubbornness that dragged them forward. Wonder for the seeds of the future they planted without ever knowing what they'd become. You are their answer to the question of why they didn't give up. They didn't give up because someday someone would need to tell their story. And here you are, safe, warm, and alive, listening to that story as you drift gently towards sleep. When you zoom out from the tiny bands of half-frozen humans clinging to life 900,000 years ago, the perspective becomes dizzying. From the close-up view, it's just smoke and shivering bodies, the taste of bitter roots, and the sound of coughing children. But from the wider lens, the story becomes something cosmic. Humanity nearly blinked out, not in some sudden meteor impact or a thunderous explosion, but in a slow, grinding squeeze. The Earth's climate tightened its icy grip, and we dwindled until the entire species could have fit inside a small, modern sports arena. That's how close we came. Every one of us today, all 8 billion, scrolling, sighing, laughing, and falling asleep, are descended from a thread that thin. What does that mean for us now? It means that survival isn't some abstract virtue. It's written into us, deep in our bones. We are the descendants of the people who didn't give up when giving up would have been the easier choice. Every quirk of your daily life has roots in that story. The way you reach for comfort food when stressed echoes the desperation of people who craved fat and sweetness because they rarely had it. The way you huddle close to loved ones under a blanket on a cold night mirrors bodies pressed together in a frozen shelter. Even the way you laugh when things are bleak, well, it can't get worse, right? Comes from the ancient need to make inevitability lighter. But zooming out also shows us the fragility of our species. We like to think of ourselves as invincible, standing at the top of the food chain, masters of technology. And yet, the truth is humbler. Once upon a time, a prolonged cold snap nearly erased us. Our DNA still carries the signature of that bottleneck. We're all cousins, recent cousins, more alike than we care to admit. When you look at it from that wider view, divisions of race, nationality, or culture seem paper thin. Strip away the accents and skin tones, and you'll find the same handful of ancestors staring back at you from the ice. There's humor hidden in that too. Imagine explaining to those 1,000 survivors that one day their descendants would fight over pineapple on pizza, or that billions of us would argue online about whether cats or dogs are better, even though their reality was lions and wolves circling in the dark. They'd probably laugh or shake their heads in disbelief. From their perspective, the fact that you can order sushi at midnight or complain about Wi-Fi being slow would seem like the most absurd luxury imaginable. The near extinction also shows us that survival isn't always heroic. Sometimes it's messy, arbitrary, and lucky. We like to tell stories about triumph and ingenuity, but luck played a massive role. You are here because your ancestors happened to be standing near the right river, happened to keep a fire going just long enough, happened to stumble across honey on the day when hunger was sharpest. That doesn't make their endurance less inspiring. In some ways, it makes it more, because it means that greatness doesn't always look like a warrior on a mountaintop. Sometimes greatness looks like a tired woman digging one more root, or a man muttering as he blows on stubborn embers until they glow again. In today's world, when we zoom out, we see that we're still wrestling with the same patterns. Climate change, resource scarcity, the need for cooperation, over division, they're all echoes of the Ice Age bottleneck. The same instincts that carried us then are the ones we need now. We survived because we shared, because we taught, because we laughed. We didn't survive because one strong person took charge, but because the group held together through the leanest nights. So when you feel small, when you think your problems or your efforts don't matter, zoom out. Remember that your existence is part of a story that stretches across nearly 1 million years. Every heartbeat is linked to theirs. Every breath you take is part of a chain that almost snapped but didn't. That's not small, it's enormous. You're not just one person drifting off to sleep tonight. You are the continuation of something astonishing, the species that refused to vanish. And now, let the story soften, because tonight, you're not crouched in a wind-battered shelter. You're not gnawing on bark while your stomach aches. You're here, in a bed, with warmth wrapping around you, The fire you sit beside isn't a fragile pile of embers, but the quiet hum of electricity, the glow of a lamp, the steady warmth of heating that doesn't need to be coaxed back to life with ash and breath. You are safe. That's a luxury your ancestors couldn't have imagined, and one you can breathe deeply into now. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, the faint crackle of their fires, the whispered jokes, the soft coughs of children huddled together. They are far away in time, but close, in your blood. They carried you here, without knowing it, through the bottleneck, through silence, through ingenuity. And now, you carry them, every cell in your body, holding the memory of survival. It's good to pause in gratitude, not the loud, ceremonial kind, but the quiet sort that settles in your chest. Gratitude for blankets, for food, for the fact that your greatest threat tonight might be forgetting to charge your phone, not starving in the dark. Gratitude for laughter, for companionship, for the fragile but persistent thread that binds us all together. So let yourself drift. The story has widened and narrowed again, from the immense sweep of history down to you, lying here. The wind outside may whisper, but it isn't the growl of predators. The shadows may flicker, but they're only the play of streetlights or the glow of passing cars, not the menace of something circling in the dark. You are safe, warmer than your ancestors ever dreamed. And as you sink deeper into rest, you join a long line of sleepers. They slept, even in fear. They slept, even in hunger. They closed their eyes beside fires that threatened to die out. And somehow, they woke again. You close your eyes now in peace, knowing you will wake to warmth, to light, to another day that carries their story forward. Let the silence cradle you. Let the thought of them soften into comfort, not fear. They survived the cold, so you could rest in warmth. They laughed, so you could smile. They endured, so you could close your eyes tonight with the simple, miraculous luxury of safety. You are the dream they never dared to imagine, the cozy present built on a frozen past. So breathe slow, let gratitude carry you, and let sleep take you gently, like a firelight fading into the dawn. And now, it's time to let go of the cold nights, the crackling fires, and the long echoes of our ancestors. Let your body sink into rest, knowing you're safe, warm, and part of a story that never broke. Sleep well, dream deeply, and if you're still awake, you can keep wandering with me by clicking one of the 2 videos on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe so next time, when you need another journey into the past to carry you to sleep, you'll be right here with me again. Good night.